Hey everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is part of the monthly webinar series organized by the New Hampshire Food Alliance. The purpose of the webinars are to highlight the diversity of food system work happening in the state, share knowledge, connect network partners, and build relationships. All webinar attendees are muted and will remain muted for the duration. If you want to comment or ask a question, there is a chat icon usually located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Click on that to open the chat box and type in your comment or question. We will pause at the end of the first speaker to answer any questions, and then again at the end of the webinar for a longer question and comment period. We will relay your questions and comments to the presenters. The webinar is also being recorded and will be able to be accessed through the New Hampshire Food Alliance website. So today's webinar, Indigenous New Hampshire Foodways and History, will feature leaders of the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. Presenters are Svetlana Peshkova, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Women's Studies at the University of New Hampshire, and Paul and Denise Pouliot from the Capitalistic band of the Pennacook-Abenaki people. So Lana, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, my name is Svetlana Peshkova, and I'm a core member of the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective and an associate professor of anthropology at UNH. Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective is a collaboration between tribal leaders of the Capitalistic band of the Pennacook-Abenaki people and other Indigenous peoples, the faculty, staff, and students at the University of New Hampshire, and local community members, volunteers, educators, and activists. Our aim is to contribute to public education by decolonizing New Hampshire history, or by, in other words, reframing it from an Indigenous perspective. Through critical research and analysis of archival material, existing publications, town histories, and a direct correspondence with living descendants, we map Indigenous sites of cultural and historical significance, write about local Indigenous history and present, and work on establishing Native American and Indigenous Studies minor at UNH, and also create various materials for public education. Indigenous knowledge and heritage are important educational resources that could enrich our communities on professional and personal levels. Our local communities reside on the traditional lands and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present, who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. Our collective is an important educational intervention into an ongoing effort to build an enduring relationship between various non-Indigenous communities and local Indigenous communities in the state of New Hampshire. To ensure ecological and cultural sustainability, we must come together to learn about Indigenous heritages locally and globally. Speaking from personal experience as an educator, I see firsthand a lack of knowledge that Indigenous heritage has in New Hampshire. For example, in the fall 2018, I taught an honors course at UNH which enrolled 18 honors students. These are our best students. Not a single one of them could recollect any sustainable knowledge about Indigenous heritage that they have received in their previous education. This signals a problem to me, a problem of lack of knowledge and recognition of Indigenous heritage on the part of the students and educators at various levels. This in turn propels our collective in an ongoing collaborative work that aims to address this problem. INHCC, or Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective, has a vision, and the first part of it is to foster public knowledge about local Indigenous heritage by introducing programmatic changes at and producing educational materials for public schools and colleges. Second, we want to ensure a symbolic recognition of Indigenous history and present contributions of Native Americans to the well-being of our state and to the wider community. And finally, we want to create a community center, which would be a place for community building and education for all residents of the state. There are several words and phrases that became commonplace for our collective. One of them is Indigenous Peoples, a phrase that we use to refer to the diverse local traditional inhabitants who occupied and stewarded the land and its resources for at least 12,000 years. Another term is Western knowledge, which we use to refer to the pro-colonial body of knowledge that omits recognition of local and other indigenous peoples' complex and diverse cultures and histories, and their impacts on and contributions to the global society prior, during, and after colonial settlements. To address this lack of knowledge, we deploy a decolonial approach, which calls for a critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform pro-colonial perspectives on local histories and science. This allows us to be more attuned to alternative histories, stories, and facts, including an indigenous perspective that challenges existing historical and sociocultural narratives in this state and elsewhere. The collective's work rests on three pillars or three principles: public education, restorative justice activism, and local focus. Projects that we work on are meant to benefit all residents of New Hampshire, indigenous or not, and are publicly accessible. For example, we visit local schools and historical societies in various public events, including powwows and conferences. Our activism is driven by values of restorative justice and community building in the state of New Hampshire. The focus of our work is always local. The value of restorative justice cannot be overstated. Creating knowledge and building relations requires participatory pedagogy within the collective and between the collective and others. We're purposeful in our learning with and from each other and not about others, and call on everyone to adopt this approach. We rely heavily on collaborative work, which takes long hours and incorporates vetting of all sources, collective's consensus, and recognition that any knowledge that we produce or create is dynamic, and so it can change. We need to be open to challenging our own views in order to create change in our local communities. In the efforts to decolonize local histories and heritage, we rely heavily on decolonial methodology that a Maori scholar, Linda Tuhawai Smith, defines as an effort to a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform research practices. Our work in community outreach actively bring in and lift up Indigenous voices, support Indigenous issues, and work against narratives that ignore or silence Indigenous history and presence. We value storytelling, which helps to preserve histories, traditions, beliefs, and values for generations. Our collective utilizes storytelling through parts of our online virtual map that I will refer to as a story map from now on, with places of Indigenous significance. We utilize storytelling and podcasting and in short films on YouTube, such as the one about the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum in New Hampshire. We also work on indigenizing history and theory by delinking and reassociating or reconnecting places and ideas with Indigenous communities. We advocate Indigenous representing. Indigenous people have a right to represent themselves. They speak for themselves and on their own terms. This occurred, for example, in Durham, New Hampshire last fall during an event called Ask an Indigenous Person, led by our Indigenous collaborators. We work by reframing issues surrounding Indigenous communities in a way that asserts that Indigenous knowledge deserves equal respect. We insist that each perspective has a value and there is not a single absolute truth when it comes to history. Finally, sharing knowledge with, for, by, and among Indigenous peoples and others benefits the larger New Hampshire community. We share our knowledge and research with the broader public through online write-ups, social media, story maps, podcasts, visits, and talks. Following Indigenous values, the knowledge we share is free, accessible, and collaborative. We do not profit from the knowledge produced. Now, some examples of our work. In the fall 2018, the collective produced a short YouTube clip surveying UNH students' opinions about changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, created some educational resources for the state lawmakers on this issue, and then finally, in the spring 2019, we co-organized a public forum that discussed establishing Indigenous Peoples Day at UNH. In the fall 2018, the collective attended New Hampshire's Council for Social Studies conference in Manchester, where we conducted a workshop for local public schools educators focusing on educational resources we produce, but more importantly, we listened to the educators talk about their needs and abilities to learn and share Indigenous heritage and history at New Hampshire public schools. In January-March 2019, the collective created and held an exhibit at the UNH Diamond Library. The exhibit introduced visitors to the indigenous naming, use, stories, and histories of the Abenaki, known to English speakers as the White Mountains in New Hampshire. If you Google Indigenous New Hampshire or enter indigenousnh.com as a URL address, you will get an access to our getaway website that provides write-ups on Indigenous history and heritage and a link to the story map, an online program that allows one to virtually travel the places of Indigenous significance in the state. The website also has links to our podcasts and social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The next slide is an image of our getaway website. The next slide is an image of our story map that has 30 entries at this point and is growing. The next slide will introduce you to our Indigenous collaborators, Denise and Paul Pouliot, who will continue this podcast.
Kwai everyone, Kwai Needlebach. Welcome friends. My name is Paul Pouliot, the Sagama of the Cossack Band of Pennacook-Abenaki people, and with me is my wife Denise.
Hi, I'm Denise Pouliot. I'm Sagama Squaw, or head female speaker of the Cossack Band of the Pennacook-Abenaki people.
We're going to start off today with a statement that's always given by Indigenous people that we're the keepers and caretakers of this Earth Mother. And this is part of a presentation that we do that covers all of our foodways, but this is primarily centered on the plant world today. Our primal connection goes back to about 13,000 years ago. The Paleo Indigenous people here, which we believe were our distant ancestors, were here 13,000 years ago. And roughly 1,000 years ago or so, we're not quite sure the exact time period, but agriculture started to creep in to our culture. So there was a strong connection between the people and our world place. We consider ourselves not by these names you hear us today, we consider ourselves Almambak, or human beings. In this world, which is, we consider New Hampshire today, was Nandakina, or our world place. And in that place, we maintain the forest, and we did various techniques to maintain that forest for slash and burning to clear the pathways and created fields and trails. And we deliberately planted and took advantage of the way things grew. So if we slashed and burnt, we would see that blueberries and strawberries and raspberries would come into those fields after we did that. And it would bring other animals into our environment to share those resources, and we shared those animals as well. Now, when we look at our culture, we're not going to dwell too much on this, but we look at the 4 seasonal time periods, and we also recognize that because we're hunter-gatherers, we did migrate. And there's debate whether or not a main village in the right location could sustain us at all times, but we had times when we wanted to hunt moose, and we had winter hunting camps. We had late winter camps for making maple syrup, and there were main villages and there were seashore villages. And we're going to talk mainly about those that were in the growing season time period. So into our plant world. People don't think of oak trees as being an important food resource, but nuts of all sorts were harvested selectively for their taste. Today we see a lot of red oak and black oak here, but swamp oak, the white oaks, the ones that had less tannin, and bur oaks were deliberately cultivated when we had an opportunity, because we found that they tasted better. And these bur oaks and white oaks were very important. Not to mention there were the importance of all the other nuts. This whole area was filled with hickory and butternut and beech and chestnut and hazelnuts. All of these were abundant. Each one of them had a place in the harvesting process for us. And sometimes some of these could still be gathered in the springtime. So it made it easy for us to find acorns even in the early spring that didn't get germinated, and we could still use those. Acorns mainly were dried and made into flour or mixed with water and pounded, and the oils would be separated with the water and the heating of the two products together. So we look at our paleo ancestors, and we can look at the Ice Age movies. We were crazy like that squirrel. We loved acorns, and it was an important part of our resources. The nuts that we do highlight are the acorns, walnuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and you can see that list. Butternut was very big here, but today you'd be hard-pressed to find any. When we get into green vegetables, this is a little more interesting. Because it's so seasonal, green vegetables were important, but it was really critical to harvest them at the right time. Milkweed had to be harvested at the earliest growth sign, much like asparagus. You don't want it to go beyond the point of edibility, and it gets fibrous and tough. Same thing occurs with the ferns. The fiddleheads and the cinnamon ferns were often taken very early because they were still tender enough to eat. Today we only focus on the fiddleheads, but cinnamon ferns, which are a little more fibrous, were also eaten as a regular snack. Here's a picture of some fiddleheads, and I could say today is now the time to go to the better grocery stores. You'll find fiddleheads just like you would find asparagus. It's very tasty, and it can be well used as cold or heated vegetable. What people didn't realize was there were many other plants that, as hunter-gatherers, we were able to figure out that wood lilies and Canada lilies and Turk's cap lily could be harvested in the fall after the growth period, and they had many nutrients, and they were very sweet in the fall. And these became another part of our diet. Here's what a wood lily would look like if you find one in the forest. Other various roots which are really very interesting, and more interesting to us because they're more accessible and more easily harvested, are the sunchokes, which we today call Jerusalem artichokes, but in the old days, this is what we call them, and groundnuts were the other one. These were harvested when they were dormant, and they had the highest potential value for the fall, winter, and early spring. Here's what the sunchokes look like. At our tribal headquarters, we have a very highly controlled population of this. It's one of those plants that if you allow it, it will take over everything. But it is a wonderful tuber, and only 2 days ago, we had a meal with venison and these sunchokes. So it's an interesting alternative to potatoes, and it's very nutritious.
High in inulin. It's a good medicinal plant to help stay off diabetes as well.
The other one is groundnuts, and it looks like a sweet pea in a lot of ways, and if you find them, you can pull them up. They're also edible by just boiling, just like the sunchokes. This is a list of plants that we know we gathered as hunter-gatherers, and the reason we know this is true is people say, well, how did you know we actually harvested this or that? Well, in our language, if we can find references in our language about certain plants, then we know that we actually harvested them or cultivated them. And so here's a list of some of the other plants or in a list, so you can see that language does support the contention that we did actually maintain these plants. What people don't realize, and this is an interesting part of our culture, is things like cattails were very important. When we speak about gardening, we have to reflect that gardening in the colonial construct thinks of a plowed field, a definable thing bounded by stone walls. And yet it's more than that, because our word for garden is medicine field. Nibi wozon ki kon on. It means a medicine field. So food is medicine, and the root word there is nibi, and nibi wozon means medicine. So we looked at plants and gardens as a place that medicines came to nourish us, whereas colonial farm, as we call habito, which is a loan word from the French, meaning he's a guy that plows fields. So when you look at those two constructs, we looked at our gardens as separate. And when we sowed, it was kika winino, which means we actually did sow the soil to plant. And this is much later than we would have been harvesting things like swamps and other water areas where we find these medicinal plants. So when we talk about gardens, we look at things like even the wetlands as being a garden. Later on, started to really focus on growing in a specific area were obviously the corn, beans, squash, pumpkins. At this point, the sunchokes and sunflowers were already there, so more selectively and knowing where they grew. What has been documented is we planted them with a center mound. We used the corn in the middle. We used the beans to grow around the corn, and that would be hanging onto the corn. And the squash and the pumpkins would grow around the mound because the varieties we had prickly vines, which kept most animals out of there from nibbling, like the deer. And it also provided moisture control. Now, everybody knows about Plymouth Plantation. They heard all the stories about Thanksgiving and how we taught the colonials to use fish for fertilizer. We had various fish, which we called garden fish. And you say, well, what's that mean? Well, a garden fish is a fish that wasn't suitable for normal eating or drying because too many bones or they just didn't have the right flesh. So it wasn't a waste to take something that we got like a sucker fish, to use them and put it in for fertilizer was a logical thing. How do we learn to do this? Generations and generations of experimentation, I'm sure, but subtleties like putting small rocks in the mounds on the outside for heat absorption, kind of a passive solar approach, also increased our production in the germination of the seeds because we had a little mound that was more heated because of the rocks. We didn't have the little dome things that you see today over your squash and pumpkins. We actually just used these rocks and it would absorb the heat. This is a picture of some various corn varieties. I'm sure that you look at the first one on the bottom, it doesn't look like corn, but the original grains were kind of random like this. And we think the original corns that we had were probably like the lower left of the picture. The flint corns, the harder corns, kind of evolved over time, what we call Indian corn today, you see on the right. The beans, wonderful beans. Beans of all varieties were developed, exchanged through different trade routes. We all shared beans, and beans became quite popular because the multiple little varieties, and they don't cross-pollinate as well as like corn does. So we had very distinct types of beans. And the squash is the same thing. Quite a few varieties of squash, most of which we still grow today, heirlooms and otherwise, and they hold up extremely well. We still have in storage some of the squash we grew from last year. Let's get back to those three sisters again. It's important to emphasize this because this is something you can do at home. And we encourage schools to teach the students. You know, everybody grows beans in your little classroom, you know, before the school year's out, and they take them home and we don't know what happens with them. But we'd like to see more schools actually developing planting techniques like we used, and start this in the beginning of the year. And so when the students return back to school in the fall, they can actually reap the benefits of what they did in the spring. And they could use the same techniques like as described here to build these little gardens and see if they actually do work. And we've been asking, we know we did this at Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum. We did it at the Children's Museum in Dover a couple of years ago. And we know quite a few schools are actually doing this kind of little mini project to show how Indigenous people supported their lifeways with the Three Sisters. This is a picture of what it looks like. While I'm at this point, this is another nice picture of various flint corns which were developed in this time period and became colonially recognized. The harvesting strategies are important as well, and that's something that people need to understand. Because we understood the growth patterns of plants, everybody thinks everything was late fall, and we didn't really eat corn in what we call in the milk. We used the corn, hard corn, because we made flours and we ground that up, and it was hulled for winter storage. So the idea of corn on the cob with butter was not really a part of one of our agendas. It was always to get it to that point of its fullest nutritional value. And we always allowed the earliest on the stalk to be left on there to fully ripen, so that it would be the replanted product for our next spring. And if you think of that strategy, it's pretty good, because the earliest part of the corn that developed and was ripened obviously was going to be push the calendar back a little bit on how long it would take to grow. So selectively using the best years was always important. Winter storage, we also had words for putting corn into the ground, and people think that means we're sowing it. And that isn't true. It was an idea that we were putting into storage, and caches were made of woven sacks and birch bark lined pits. And these kinds of techniques, my father documented back into the 1930s that they were still doing this in 1930, storing food in the ground in caches. And as a child in the 1930s, he was well assimilated into the dominant culture. For him, it was surprising to see that they were actually still in Canada putting foodstuffs in the ground in this state. And with that, I guess we're ready for questions.
So folks, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. And I don't know if any of us here have questions to kick it off, but.
I'd just like to offer that children and people can learn how to garden on their own at home. And they can do it relatively on an inexpensive ways by using recycled materials for planters and collecting the seeds from foods that they currently eat now. We always try to grow organic, non-GMO foods. However, not everybody has access to that. And so we encourage people just to try to grow food on their own, even if it's something small in a container in an apartment on your windowsill.
Great. So we do have a couple questions coming in here. Let's see, they're moving faster than I can keep up with. So how does one get access to the website and information shared in the webinar? We will send an email to everyone who registered for the webinar, and it will have a recording of the webinar and a link to where that will be posted. So someone also said they missed the introduction. Can you repeat who you are and where you're from?
My name is Denise Pouliot, and I'm the Sagamo Squaw, the Kawasuk Band of the Pennacook-Abenaki people.
And I'm Paul Pouliot, the Sagamo of the Kawasuk Band of Pennacook-Abenaki people. And those two titles we gave you represent head female and head male speaker for the group.
So we have a question about, do we have more detail on how the fish fertilizer was made?
The fish fertilizer, because we were hunter-gatherers and fish, we didn't get into the fish. The fish is really another whole webinar if you want to do fish. But the fish, when we would process fish, any of the unusable product would have been put in the ground raw like that. It wasn't fermented. It just naturally was broken down by the earth and the microorganisms. I'm sure we didn't process it, if that's what you were wondering about. We literally, any fish remains would just be put into the earth deep enough so that the roots would extract the nitrogen as the protein broke down.
Basically, what he's describing would be a long, thin strip of a compost pile that you would then heap dirt over and plant your seeds in. And the nitrogen from the fish breaking down would feed the plants, but the heat during that process will also help germinate and help the seeds grow faster.
Great. So someone's asking if there's any projects like this being implemented in Massachusetts.
I'm sure there are, but I couldn't give you any specifics. I know there are several tribal groups in Massachusetts that have similar projects. Depending on where you live, you could probably, if you live out in the
seeds were historically saved from squash varieties. Was it encouraged for squash to cross-pollinate and adapt to the climate?
Good question. Just like anything you do at home, I mean, we do it today. You harvest the best looking fruit. You do take the seeds and dry them. There is a kind of a rule of thumb. You shouldn't take just one. What you should do is always selectively have several so that you have some diversity in the event there's some genetic trait that you don't like that comes out of it. And I think we figured this out over time, that you just don't use one ear corn or one squash. You take selectively a handful of them, you dry the seeds, and I don't know if we understood cross-pollination in that sense exactly. I think most squashes could cross-pollinate, but I think we probably were excited about differences if something happened strange, and we'd probably try to foster that if it was something that improved the variety.
Another question here about some suggestions to approach their local Indigenous tribes to help share their knowledge. Do you have any suggestions?
Ask.
You've got
It's very simple. Pick up the phone, make a phone call, send an email, and ask. A lot of Indigenous groups are willing to share the knowledge that they hold, but they have to be approached first. And you also have to be patient, because we're busy people. So we can't necessarily work on your time schedule. So as long as you're patient and you're willing, to ask, I would reach out. And if you're looking for the groups in your area, check out your local Commission on Native Affairs in the state where you live, and they should have a list of the tribes that are in your area.
Great. Let's see here. Can you suggest resources for teachers to use on teaching about Indigenous plants?
That is actually a topic that we're currently working on at UNH. We're developing K-12 curriculum to teach Indigenous knowledge, not just in plants and gardening, but through all aspects of Indigenous life. So that's something that is going to be forthcoming in New Hampshire. However, I do know that there are other groups that have already established some curriculum, but I do not believe there is any one particular website where you can go to. So you would have to seek out that knowledge from each individual tribe.
Okay. Another question here. Is there an app that will tell me what wild edible vegetables and fruits are in my area?
Oh, I don't know about that. I'm one that's kind of computer illiterate.
Well, it's kind of obvious that most of the things, we talked about some of the wood lilies and things like that, which are a little harder. And I don't really encourage you to wild forage plants that may be endangered. But I'll tell you this, that the sunchokes are, if you find a patch of them, they're never going to be endangered. We have a raised bed, and we started off with like a couple of dozen of the tubers, and within 1 year we had 1,000. But I would say you can wildcraft a lot of things. We do mushrooms, but a lot of these things, you got to be well educated before you go out in the field. And we don't really like to just say, just go out in the field and harvest stuff. You could find yourself eating the wrong things. It looks like a blueberry, but it's poisonous type of thing. And so always worried that people take this stuff too literally. And I would strongly you to, you can educate yourself on the internet to what you can find in your own area.
Let's see, do you have any information about irrigation techniques and moisture retention in cultivated gardens?
Well,
traditionally, we planted in the lowlands along the rivers, so we tended not to have those issues.
Looking at most of the gardens, none of them are really highlands. They seem to be all along the rivers as intervales or naturally occurring things, because these rivers weren't dammed in those times. And each spring there could have been new fields created along the Merrimack. And when we looked at the history of Concord, the Concord, Merrimack through Concord changed dramatically from different decades. So we think that these things would have naturally occurring with all the silt in the good topsoil be washed down the river and creating these locations. So I think we were never really worried about actually maintaining the moisture level. I think the critical thing is the mounds and the way they're shaped allows runoff to collect, and the leaves collect moisture, and the relationship between the corn, bean, and squash. One gathers the moisture and it drips, off the leaves, and you have moisture and dew and things like that. So there was a strategy. It just evolved, so to speak. Hopefully that answers the question.
That's great. We still have a few more minutes. If folks have other questions, feel free to type them in.
We have another question here about the White Farm, and it says, more recently, new Americans started growing produce across the street, and certainly would love to learn about the weeds, I guess is what they're talking about.
The sunchokes.
Sunchokes. This is just a random thing we suddenly discovered. It was in the fall. We tried to look at where there's various places. We live on the Sunchokes River watershed, and we looked at a lot of the farmland along Sunchokes, and we noticed these different places where we have now big cornfields. We started to look around the perimeters, and we'd see what they didn't plow and turn over, and that's where we'd find these indigenous plants, which probably go back 1,000 years. I mean, we don't really do any genetics on the wild stuff, but we're not sure how far back that was going on. So if anybody wants to buy or get into sunchokes, you can find them right now in the grocery stores as well, and you could try it, but treat it like you would mint or any other very aggressively growing plant. Put it in some soil that's very rich and with a lot of moisture, and you will have yourself some wonderful plants, and you can harvest them.
But be forewarned, our sunchokes grow to approximately 15 feet tall, and they need full sun.
They need full sun.
So make sure you have the appropriate space.
Great. Lana, did you have anything you wanted to add, or any questions or answers to any of those questions we listed?
Am I able to talk?
Yes.
So I actually put the link there for everybody on our website, indigenousnewhampshire.com. We have a set of, generously donated by Paul and Denise Pouliot, a set of recipes of indigenous foods that one can, try at home. One could also be creative and add some of the contemporary, butter and sweets to them. But some of our collaborative collective members have cooked some of those recipes, and they're pretty cool. I would like to ask Paul to talk a little bit about fish. I think just because our collective, majority of people in the collective located in the seacoast area, and I think food is one of those important sources that one can elaborate on a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, we've got a couple other questions we may be able to answer in the time period. The fish, we really believe that the majority of our protein came from fish resources. Fish migrated from the earliest ice out to the first ice formation. And we called fish like the earliest smelt were called winter fish, as well as the tomcod, which came at the other extreme of the season. So fish became a protein resource that pretty much, until everything got really frozen over, and it was available. And if you look at that strategy of following fish migrations, you had a very wonderful diet. You think today about the omegas and the salmon and all that stuff, which we say we want to eat paleo. The paleo ended with the grains, and people don't realize that grain does not fit into the paleo construct of what a paleo diet was. And that's why we say it was the beginning of the end for us, because fish with the strong omega profiles, especially the salmon, the trout, and all those migratory fish were wonderful for us. And the ones we didn't use for food became our fertilizer, and it's self-explanatory. But that's another whole hour of discussion about that. And hopefully that answers or it filled in that little gap, but it's an important thing. People think we hunted moose and deer and bear all the time, but that was part of the protein stream, but the fish was a major community involvement. Making wares and netting and all that stuff is part of our culture, especially along the coast, where we could have taken capitalized on the opportunities of beached whales and porpoise and things like that. There was a lot of things that would wash up on the shore that we could also harvest. So there's different strategies that we have about how we filled in our protein niches, if you want to call it that, for oils and fats.
Paul and Denise, there is a question about the federally recognized or state recognized tribes in the state of New Hampshire. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Okay,
our tribe is on record with the Bureau of Interior through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We are in a what you call a status of petition, but we are not recognized by the state or the federal government. We are considered a pre-constitutional tribe before the Constitution. Our involvement with the federal government and the state was back in Washington's time period, and we're somewhat happy that we're not involved in the politics of being in a federally recognized tribe. We're still protected by law, and the state knows we're here. And it is the Cossack Band of the Pennacook-Abenaki people. We're on record with the Secretary of State in the AG's office in the state.
Right. You can find our website at cowasuck.org. That's COWASUCK.org, O-R-G.
And if you are a Facebook follower, we have very extensive Facebook page, which covers all kinds of Indigenous activities in the country. We're like a network of resources if you look at us on Facebook. So look up Cowasuck Band of the Pennacook-Abenaki people on Facebook, and you'll find a lot of resources there as well.
Do the words Cowasuck, Pennacook, and Abenaki have an English translation?
Okay, a good question. What these names mean? We never used them until colonial contact. We call ourselves human beings. We were one extended family of people. People can't wrap their heads around that because the colonials always looked for a king or a queen or a leader. We're matriarchal. We were all extended families of grandmothers, daughters, and granddaughters. And all these tribal names that you see today, they were given to us by the Bureau of Ethnology, Smithsonian. As they were trying to document the disappearing people, they put place names on all of us. We find it offensive, but we are obligated to work with the state and federal government using place names, which were never part of our culture. My father and grandparents said we never used any of these names that you use today. This is a colonial construct that was imposed on us, that they felt we came from one place and only one place. If you're a U.S. citizen and a U.S. citizen, now it would be like saying, what town are you from? And that's what we're going to call you. That is not the way we looked at ourselves, if that answers that question.
What are the words?
The words, what? Cowasuck means the place of the white pines. And we've done some research, and there are intervales with large stands of white pines, hence why you call Coos County. That was an area along Connecticut and up into the upper watershed of the Connecticut. There were pine trees, and that was kind of our locus of where we came from, upper Connecticut, and the Coos County is obviously still named that today. Hopefully that answers that question.
Great. Let's see. Yeah.
All right, we have one. Living in a current capitalistic society, how can farming for profit as well as for education be respectful to our earth and Indigenous peoples and history? This is an interesting one. We were at a conference for the last 2 days at Dartmouth, exactly on food sustainability. And different tribes have different approaches. And we were fascinated to find that some tribes are extremely proactive in trying to cover their foodways from birth to finished product, including everything from controlling their own grains and feedstock for their cattle and their bison, to the whole processing of it, to the point where they don't allow anybody to process their food because they want ultimate and total control that it's pure and clean. And they admitted to us that they don't want to use these organic or naturally grown or grass-fed because they do everything they can to make it pure and clean, but they're not playing into the construct of what is organic, what is non-GMO. They do their best to make sure that the environment is protected and their resources from, like I say, from the cattle feedstock is all maintained by them, and they're quite proud of the fact they control every aspect of their foodways.
So it can be done.
It can be done.
It's a matter of figuring out what exactly you want to capitalize on and figuring out the best ways to do that.
And this tribe actually has their own casino, and they don't take outside. They actually use that food in their casino. So it's like even their public, even their elders, everybody is fed from the same food environment that they've created, and it's a wonderful concept. There was a Quapaw Nation. They cover a corner of Oklahoma, Arkansas. The Quapaw. If you look them up, you'll find that they are just a fascinating tribal entity that is doing a wonderful job with their foodways.
Great. I think we've answered all of the questions that have been typed in so far. Are there any events or ways that people can get involved in work that you're doing, or anything you want to share about events coming up?
Well, if you go to indigenousnh.com, there is a list of events that our collaborative gets involved in. As far as tribally, you can find all our postings on Facebook. That seems to be the fastest and the best way to reach out to us. You can always messenger us on Facebook as well, or send us emails.
This is an interesting subject matter. Everybody's interested in foodways, and I don't think a week goes by when there's not another conference or another thing like this webinar coming up. All you can do is keep track of us on Facebook, and we try to keep posting what's happening. There's quite a few events, I think, that are coming up in the next few months that may be of interest, but you know, being a seasonal thing about growing, we take the opportunities. This is the time period to talk about foodways.
Right. The question popped up that said, what is the Facebook page name? It's Kawasak Band of the Pennacook-Abenaki People. If you just type in Kawasak and Pennacook, it should pop right up.
And we'll try to get that link in there.
What's this language here?
Oh, someone asked about the language.
The language, okay.
Trying to catch up on all the postings here.
Someone asked about language. What was the language question?
I think it was about pronunciation.
Of pronunciation? Unless you're fluent in a language, it's kind of difficult to go over that. We didn't spend any time on all of the Abenaki words for all of the, this wasn't a language lesson. We wanted to show you the connection between our language and our culture, that if we had it in our language, then we know we actually harvested or ate those particular things. So when we look at that, the way we can roll back the clock is to look at our language and see what else was in there.
Want to say a sentence or two in the language so they can at least hear it?
Or they want to hear something?
Yeah.
Okay. We do a universal kind of a greeting, and it's Kwai Kwai, Nagwed Kamit, Gozawak, Tanidalbak, Alanambak. What it is, it's a connective sentence, and it says, welcome, friends and family, and all you others, Alanambak, human beings. And the connecting words is ta, which is like our word for and. It's a very fluid, very descriptive, and kind of rhythmic language. It kind of flows like poetry.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I'll just mention that the New Hampshire Food Alliance hosts webinars once a month, and they're always free. Our next webinar coming up is on June 11th, and we're featuring Ian McSweeney of Agrarian Trust, and he's going to be presenting about the creation of a local agrarian commons. So check out our website and you can register for that. If you have any questions, feel free to email us or type it in the chat. Like I said, we're recording this, and so that will be available to you when we email it out. And thank you all so much for being on the webinar today.